Welcome to Horse Health. This is Dawn Lupul for Horse Racing Alberta. Today we discuss cardiac arrhythmias with Dr. Sian Durward-Akhurst and what we can do to help our horses out.
When you look at the rate of sudden cardiac death, it's a little bit difficult to get an exact estimate. The Jockey Club Injury Database releases the number of deaths during racing each year. And last year in the US, it was 1.22 per 1,000 race starts. But when you look at the numbers that are sort of sudden death rather than catastrophic breakdowns like fractured legs and things like that, it's about 20% of that number. And then when you take that a little bit further and look at the necropsy findings from these horses, about half of them end up with a diagnosis. And a lot of those are some kind of cardiac abnormality, so a big catastrophic rupture of a vessel or something like that. But the remaining half we suspect are cardiac arrhythmias, because when you die from a fatal cardiac arrhythmia, quite often there's no changes in your necropsy, so everything looks normal. And the only way to know for sure that the horse has died from a fatal arrhythmia would have been to have an electrocardiogram on the horse at the time that it collapsed and died, which is because it's such a sporadic thing, we just don't have. So what we're really interested in is, can we figure out which horses are at high risk of developing sudden cardiac death? And if we can, then can we monitor them more closely to try and prevent this happening? Because it may be that these horses are just fine to race, but on certain days there's changes in their ECGs, which means that they're not safe. And so they should be rested for a period of time. And we're doing this in two different ways. So first of all, we're looking at the horse's genetics. At this point in time, we haven't found any. We don't know what variants are of interest in horses. So we've got sequencing of the whole genome of the horse from 50 sudden cardiac death cases and 50 controls. And we're going to analyze that to look to see whether or not there's any variants that are present more often in the sudden cardiac death cases than in the sudden cardiac death controls. And then we'll follow that up in a new population of horses to check that it is associated with sudden cardiac death and they're not just there by random chance, because it's really important when we're developing a genetic test to make sure that we can really rely on it and trust it. Our goal with that would be to develop it into genetic markers that we can predict horses that are at high risk of developing cardiac arrhythmias and or sudden cardiac death. And then we'll follow up with those horses so that we can monitor them more closely. So the other part of the study is to look at ECGs. At the moment, the only way we can tell whether horses are having arrhythmias at exercise is when they're wearing an ECG at that point in time, which is possible, but it unfortunately requires a specialist to interpret because there's an awful lot of movement artifact. So when we look at an ECG, if you look at the top one, you can see that the big V shapes are pretty regular the whole way across the ECG. And the top line is fairly smooth. There's a little bit of movement, but it's pretty regular, and it's pretty easy to see where those V shapes are. When you look at the bottom image, this is a horse at exercise, and this is a relatively good quality ECG. And you can see that the V's are more difficult to see, and there's other smaller V's that are interspaced in between the V's. And it's much more difficult to read. And while it's possible, it requires time and a specialist to look at them. And the issue with that is it's really hard to do an awful lot of horses with that at one time. So our goal is to look and see whether or not changes in the at-rest ECG can be used to predict whether horses will go on to have an arrhythmia at exercise. And if that's the case, then it will be relatively easy to be able to screen very large numbers of horses just using at-rest ECGs and then computational analysis. And we have a collaboration with a group at the University of Surrey, and they've got a computational approach to doing this. And what's really cool about their research so far is that they've been able to show that horses that have had atrial fibrillation, which is commonly known as flipping the heart, when they go back to a normal rhythm, you can identify them using a clip of normal rhythm ECG. Because they're different compared to horses that have never had atrial fibrillation, even though when you look, if you or I looked at the ECG today, it looks relatively normal, but the computer can tell that there's differences. So we're hoping to find that for horses that have exercising arrhythmias as well, because these are the arrhythmias that we know are very common, but in some horses, we think these are the causes of the sudden cardiac deaths. So the combination at the end of the day combined will have, our goal is to have some form of genetic test which will be able to predict horses that are at high risk of sudden cardiac death, and then some kind of ECG analysis software that would be able to take an at-rest ECG and predict which horse is likely to be a problem. So when we look at how do we detect arrhythmias? So we detect them using electrocardiograms or ECGs or EKGs. And that really is just a measure of what the horse's heart is doing and the electrical activity of the horse's heart. They're very simple to put in place. They just go on either under the saddle or under the harness, and they just are connected by little electrodes. And then when we look at what we're looking at is the big sort of upside down V shapes on this arrhythmia. We want them to be nice and regular, as you can see in this image. And what that means is the electrical activity in the heart is starting where it should, and it's traveling along the pathways that it's supposed to, through the atria and then down into the ventricles. And that's nice and normal. But when we look at a horse, this is a horse that has atrial fibrillation. And you can see from the image of the heart on the right that rather than those little arrows going straight from the atria around in a nice smooth current down into the ventricles, they're going in little circles, which is abnormal. And that means that the atria just keep contracting. And every once in a while, there's an electrical pulse that goes down to the ventricles. So when you look at the ECG, you can see that the big upside down V shapes are much more irregular. So there's two, and then there's a bit of a gap, and then there's two, and then a bit of a gap. And the little the small V shapes that are going up and down in the sort of undulating baseline, that's related to the circles that are going on with the atria and the arrhythmia that's going on there. As a geneticist, I'm obviously interested in finding a genetic cause for a lot of things, because genetics play a big role in so many different disease phenotypes and even health traits as well. But if we can find the underlying cause, then we can figure out what's going on and why these horses are having episodes of atrial fibrillation. But when you look at the heritability, and that's the proportion, we sort of call it the proportion of variation in the phenotype. So what that means is how much of a horse having atrial fibrillation can be explained by genetics. And when you look at that, about 30% of a horse developing atrial fibrillation is based on its pedigree. So what the breeding history is. At the moment, no one's looked at the genetics underlying that specifically. So they've just looked at what their sires and dams are. They haven't looked at genetic markers, and that's one of our goals to look at as well. But there's been a relatively recent paper in thoroughbreds that's shown that the heritability in thoroughbreds is really low to almost non-existent. So it seems that maybe in thoroughbreds it's maybe a bit more sporadic, but maybe in standardbreds there's more of a genetic link. But right now we're focusing on standardbreds because we have pretty good data to show that there's definitely a genetic component. In the future, we may think about that in thoroughbreds as well. What's really surprising when we look at these exercising arrhythmias is they're really, really common. So almost half of standardbreds have some kind of arrhythmia at exercise, which is a tremendous number, and about 30% of thoroughbreds as well. But when you look more specifically in the standardbreds, about 16% of them have arrhythmias that are known to be fatal in humans, and they flip into them and quite often flip out to them. And these are in completely healthy horses, which is really remarkable. And we don't know why. We know that in humans, similarly, some humans flip into really quite nasty arrhythmias and then they flip back out of them as well. But what we really want to know is what makes those potentially devastating arrhythmias fatal. Because if we can figure that out, is it a weather thing? Is it something they're eating? Is it too much training, not enough training? too much racing, not enough racing. What is it that what is it that triggers that? Because then we can try and help those horses and prevent them going from, exercising really well to having sudden cardiac death. Our whole study is really quite large. So we're doing a cardiac examination on 1,000 racehorses, and we have the goal of collecting 500 standardbreds and 500 thoroughbreds. And at the moment, we're just over halfway there. And this examination includes listening to the horse's heart and then doing an ECG and an echocardiogram. And the reason we're looking at the ultrasound, which is there's a picture here at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide, is because we're interested in horses that have normal hearts. Horses that have abnormalities in the structure is a future direction for us to look at. Right now, we want horses that cannot be detected by any other means than exercising ECGs or the research we're doing, because those individuals and humans at least have shown there's a pretty good genetic link. We also have 200 thoroughbreds that we are in the process of collecting with sudden cardiac death, and then also 100 standardbreds with atrial fibrillation, and that's the horses that we'll use to identify the possible sudden cardiac death or atrial fibrillation causing variants that will then follow up in a new population to make sure that those variants are really causing either disease.
How much funding is there for these projects? Probably not enough, but it is very important for the industry.
It's hugely important for the industry, and funding is always our biggest challenge, because we need to pay for the students and for collecting this. We've been very lucky to have grants from several places. So the University of Minnesota has given us funding to do this, the American Association of Equine Practitioners, the Grayson Jockey Club Foundation, Morris Animal Foundation, and then the Minnesota Racing Commission. They've all given us research dollars to spend on this. In the future, we'll have to look at more grants just to keep this research going, because it is tremendously expensive, and it is a very big issue. But especially a lot of the animal foundation grants, they're interested in things that are really, really prevalent. So something like pituitary pars intermedia dysfunction or metabolic syndrome, because they affect so many horses. Whereas sudden cardiac death, fortunately, is relatively rare. However, it's also a huge problem, and it's disastrous and it's fatal. So that's one of our struggles, but we're working on it, and we will keep writing grants and hopefully keep this research going. What I'd really like to do, and this links into your question about grant funding, is continue collecting horses. What my hope is if we can figure out that there's a way of using at-rest ECGs, that makes it much, much easier, because we could just go out and we could go around a barn. So there's 100 horses in the barn. I could do all 100 horses within a day, because I only need about 10 to 15 minutes of ECG trace. The issue with the exercising ones is that we put them on, we have to have them on for about 5 to 10 minutes before the horses goes out. Then they go out, they train, and then they come back in, and we need to keep it on while the heart rates go back down again, which is just fine when we've got more people, but it takes time. So it also requires the horses to be training or working pretty hard, and so not every horse is trained every day. So the Minnesota Racing Commission has been hugely helpful at supporting the research. They've given us some funding dollars, but they've also the veterinarians have been really open to us being on the track. And now with the new HISA regulations, it's even more difficult to be out in the thoroughbred track. It's much more heavily regulated, and fortunately, because we're not administering or anything like that, we were able to do the training and then go out. But they've been tremendously supportive. And then the Stronach group has also been incredibly supportive. They've been helping us with some of the sudden cardiac death samples, and I've got vets across the country that are sending me hair roots from these horses, because they really want to get to the bottom of what's going on. So we couldn't do this research without not just the trainers, but the owners and the grooms and the jockeys and everybody involved, obviously the horses too, and the veterinarians. And so we've been tremendously lucky to be able to do this research and to get the support that we've had. I've seen, fortunately not one of the horses that we've necessarily had the ECG on or whatever else, but we have had one horse that broke down within a few weeks of being part of the study from, unfortunately, a leg injury. And I've seen what the barn's like afterwards. I mean, it's just every person is miserable and upset. And it's one of the reasons that this research is so important, because if we can figure out which horses are high risk, it makes it a lot easier when you have these, sudden cardiac deaths, to figure out, was it truly sudden cardiac death or is there something else going on?
So your research and other studies like this are so important, especially now, because it is absolutely devastating to anybody and everybody in the industry and outside of it as well when these unfortunate episodes happen. So kudos to you and your team for working so diligently on this, and hopefully we can maybe get some more funding for you, people who are seeing the importance of this, and we can get some answers that help in the future.
Yeah, and I'm happy if anyone has any questions or wants to talk a little bit more about the research. I'm certainly happy to discuss it. I mean, we're really excited about it, and I think it's obviously everyone thinks that their research has got great potential, but the things we're looking at are really important, and if we can figure out which horses are at higher risk, then we really could make a difference. And one of the concerns when people hear genetics is that we're going to label a horse as being, or some high level stallion as being, a sudden cardiac death stallion, and so he can never be bred. There's very few variants that would mean that we would sort of stop breeding a horse completely, especially in the thoroughbred industry, because there's so much inbreeding anyway. The last thing we want to do is reduce the genetic diversity more by removing, some of the really important stallions. But we can make educated breeding decisions. So if you've got a high genetic risk horse, and they're really good and they've had fantastic racing careers or whatever else, and you really want to breed them, then that would be fine, but you breed them to a low genetic risk horse. Whereas if you have a high genetic risk horse that's not a good racehorse, then you maybe retire that horse and don't put them into the breeding pool. So I think that's one thing that's really important. And actually that's been one of the questions we've had, is, what happens if we find horses that are at high risk? And that's where the monitoring really comes in, to figure out what the risk factors are, so we can say your horse should never race again because it's just high risk all the time, and it's constantly having arrhythmias. And unfortunately, this being a racehorse is not a good destiny for this horse. Or we can say, well, it looks like most of the time this horse is just fine, it just sometimes has arrhythmias, and so the times that it has arrhythmias, we'll say, right, scratch it, don't race it another week when the arrhythmia is back under control. But for right now, we just don't know. We don't know whether that's possible, and so that's where we're going.
Thank you for watching Horse Health with Dr. Sian Durward-Akhurst and Don Lupul for Horse Racing Alberta.